Hey everyone, welcome to the LinkedIn Presents Redefining Work podcast. I am your host, Lars Schmidt, and I'm really excited about the topic that we're going to be covering in today's episode. I'm joined by Kandi Wiens. Kandi is a fellow at the University of Pennsylvania and the author of Burnout Immunity, How Emotional Intelligence Can Help You Build Your Resilience and Help Your Relationships with Work. And the topic of burnout is certainly something that for those of us in the field of HR and frankly everywhere has been front of mind for us. And I'm really excited to get into some of the research and key discoveries that you found in the book. So Kandi, welcome to the podcast. I would love to have you open with an introduction for our audience.
Thanks, Lars. I'm happy to be here with you. Yeah, so I'm a senior fellow at University of Pennsylvania, which is basically a role where I do both teaching in our graduate level programs. Most of them are executive format. So we have a lot of HR professionals who are in our graduate programs. And I do a lot of research as well at Penn. And then outside my role at Penn, I do a lot of speaking events and workshops and been taking the Burnout Immunity book on the road with workshops and keynotes. And yeah, my research over the last 10 plus years has been primarily focused on people in very high stress roles. They tell me that their stress level is severe, very severe, or worst possible. Yet when I measure whether or not they're burned out, I study the people that are not burned out. So they experience a lot of chronic stress at work, but they're the kind of resilient role models that we can learn from, the type of people that I call having burnout immunity.
Yeah. Well, I imagine resiliency is going to be a term we're going to hear a lot of in the next 30 minutes. But let's just start with kind of a level set. From your perspective, like as an expert on burnout, how do you define burnout? Let's kind of establish that as our baseline as we get into the conversation.
Yeah. So burnout, and I'll give you the formal definition of it. This is how we researchers agree on this because, and by the way, I'm really glad that you asked the question because one of the things I'm on a mission to do is help people better understand what burnout is and what burnout isn't. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot and sometimes even misused and overused. But the more we can understand what it actually is and isn't, then we're more likely to create interventions and solutions for people and organizations. So burnout, at the way we research it, it's a psychological syndrome that people experience as a result of chronic stress at work. So a couple of key things there. Psychological syndrome means that it can come and go. What it doesn't mean is that it's not like if I'm feeling burned out for a month or so, doesn't mean that I'm doomed and will be burned out for the rest of my career. That I can do things to heal my burnout and to recover from it and get back to a baseline state of equilibrium, a level of stress. So it can come and go. And it's a result of chronic stress. So it's not necessarily the kind of stress that just happens one day where you have one horrible day or a few consecutive horrible days at work. It's truly the result of long-term stress, typically a few months or more, sometimes even up to a year. And then the third thing is that it's a result of stress that we experience at work. So that's how we study it. It doesn't necessarily measure the type of stress that we experience outside of work, although the last several years, a lot of burnout researchers agree that we can't really separate the two because when we are experiencing a high degree of stress outside of work, that zaps our capacity to deal with and manage stress at work. So my definition, the way I look at it is really more holistic, is how much stress are we under in any given context of our life for a period of time, and how much capacity do we have to deal with that stress? And if the resources that I have to deal with all the demands and all the pressures I'm under, if my resources can keep up with those, I'm most likely not going to burn out. However, when my demands and the pressures consistently exceed the resources that I have to be able to manage all of that for a long period of time, I'm going to be vulnerable to burnout and prone to burning out pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, what I appreciate about the book, there's a lot of things, but the tangible kind of examples and practices and takeaways that we can do to build resiliency to help, build more capacity to manage stress, I think is key. And you're right. And I appreciate you also mentioning both the work stress and then perhaps even the definition expanding over the last couple of years because of the sheer volume of external stress that we've had to navigate as humans. What led you to this area of focus in terms of just studying burnout, resiliency, stress at work? What kind of drew you to this field?
Yeah, I love that you asked this question, because most people, when they find out I'm a burnout researcher, they're like, why would you want to do that?
Yeah, all right.
And young Kandi, 8-year-old Kandi, would have never imagined that that's what I wanted to grow up and be or focus my energy and my career on. So I was a management consultant for about 22 years, a very lucrative career in management consulting. And it wasn't until I had my own personal experience with burnout and was also observing a lot of people in my work environment who were burned out, and also those who were in the same work environment but they were not burned out. My personal experience started with this huge, massive, life-threatening wake-up call that I had in 2011. I went into my doctor's office for a normal routine, the kind where you go in and you're out in about 20, 30 minutes. You get your A and the doctor says, see you next year. And when I went in that morning, I felt like a normal level of stress. I had a lot going on, and I had just been traveling a lot. And I remember feeling, for the most part, like that was normal. Whatever I was feeling physically felt normal to me. And the nurse was checking my vital signs. She checked my blood pressure once, twice, a third, and then a fourth time without saying anything. And she left the exam room, and I did what a lot of people will do when you're left in a room by yourself with your cell phone. I started working. I got back to email and text, and I was so focused on work and really absorbed in what I was doing that it didn't even occur to me that she had just checked my blood pressure 4 times. So she came back in a few minutes later, or about a minute later, with the doctor, and the doctor held my hand and she said, Kandi, I don't want you to worry. I want you to lay down. We're going to give you some medicine. I'm going to call your husband and have him pick you up. And then we're going to talk about what's going on. So fast forward about an hour, the anti-anxiety medicine kicked in, the blood pressure reducing medicine kicked in. When my husband showed up, she told my husband, and I'm kind of zoned out at this point, but she told him that my blood pressure reading was a 200/110, which is a hypertensive emergency. I could have had a stroke right there. I could have had a heart attack. I could have even died, right there in the exam room. My blood pressure was so dangerously high. And so my blood pressure came down as she was talking to my husband, and she told him, I don't want Kandi to do anything for the next 3 to 5 days. Like, try to keep her on the couch for at least 5 days. And my first thought was, I can't do that. I can't not work next week. Like, I have a lot of stuff going on. My second thought was, well, finally, someone's giving me an excuse to just slow down and get some sleep and recover. And then my third thought was, she's right. I'm not fine. This is something I really need to pay attention to. So that wake-up call led to a lot of personal interest in wanting to explore and study really myself. Like, what is it I am doing wrong in this work environment? Because for the most part, I loved what I was doing, although it was high stress and high pressure. But I was also part of the problem. I was not coping with stress as effectively, not nearly as effectively as I should have been. I was avoiding things. I was shutting down. I wasn't asking for help. There are many things in hindsight that I didn't do. And so this personal interest in it eventually became this intellectual curiosity where, as I was reading more and more of other people's research, I just decided I want to research this on my own. And I was in a doctoral program at the University of Pennsylvania at that time and had to decide on my dissertation topic anyway, and had been reading all this stuff about people that were burned out. But I kept asking myself this question: what about the people who are not burned out? They're working in the same environments, same stress and pressures. And I was working alongside a number of these people in management consulting, and they were not burned out. What were they doing? Were they born with some like special genes that allowed them to have, enabled them to have just high levels of resilience? Or did they win the genetic lottery somehow? Or were they raised by super cool-headed parents who were just like calm and composed all the time, and they learned these skills from their parents? Like, what was it with these people around me that I saw experiencing a lot of stress, but they weren't burned out, or at least I didn't perceive that they were burned out? So there I had my dissertation topic. So I conducted a study with chief medical officers, and that study illuminated the hypothesis that I had that there are some people in every high stress, high pressure environment or professions that can protect themselves from burnout. And so I continued that study, or not that specific study with the chief medical officers, but a couple of years later, I started studying police chiefs. So in the summer of 2020 and the fall of 2020, as we all know what was going on in the summer and fall of 2020, it was the most stressful time that these police chiefs told me they had ever experienced in their 30 plus years of their career, the most stressful experience. Yet when I measured whether or not they were burned out, there were, of course, a couple of people who were burned out at that time, but there were also a number of them that were not burned out. And then when I interviewed them, it was very clear what it was they were doing. And it was consistent with what the first study that I did with the chief medical officers. And ultimately, what I found to be true from my research is that there are really specific ways that these people use their emotional and social intelligence to cope with stress and pressures at work. And so that's how I got interested in it. And it's just like led to one thing or after another, where I really have uncovered something that no other researchers have looked at in this particular way.
Yeah. Well, I want to kind of have you expand a bit on the emotional intelligence aspect of your findings, because obviously that's a key theme of the book. And I think it's a topic certainly in the HR and people space. It's something that we talk about, we try to understand, we try to assess and evaluate from an interviewing standpoint, right? And find people that may have that ability or other, features like, having a growth mindset and a willingness to learn. But that EQ coupled with IQ, I think is kind of the holy grail a lot of times that we tend to focus on. But I think we don't do it through the lens of burnout mitigation, right? And so I'd love to learn more about your findings and how, emotional intelligence specifically helped equip these people that were dealing with the same amounts of stress, cope with that in a healthier way.
Right. And that's the key, in a healthier way. Yeah. So it is, I find it quite promising that a number of organizations have learned their lesson about EQ, or I call it EI, but that they are now hiring for emotional intelligence. And it's actually part of the screening and hiring process, the selection process. And I would say the same is true for Burnout Immunity, that HR leaders should be hiring, especially if it's a high stress profession or high stress job, executives or someone who has to travel a lot for their job. It's a job that's quite extensively demanding. We should be hiring for Burnout Immunity because of what we're seeing with how people are using their EI. So in a nutshell, the chapters of the book are actually organized around a couple of very specific EI competencies. So the first chapter is all about awareness. The second chapter is about regulation. And then there are a couple of other chapters that have to do with our how we manage work how we manage ourselves in social environments. But let me just focus on awareness and regulation first, because those are two of the core and foundational elements of emotional and social intelligence. So in the awareness chapter, I write about how having an awareness of what makes us more vulnerable to stress. So really, and I walk readers through exercises and reflection questions that help them assess what would make them particularly more at risk for burnout in a particular context. So having them look at the alignment or misalignment between what it is they really want and need in a job and in their daily work experience compared to what it is they're actually getting from their employer or from the environment. And what we find, this is no surprise, I'm sure, but when there are mismatches between what someone wants and needs in a job and their environment and what they're actually getting, the greater the mismatch, the higher the risk potential that someone's going to burn out or that they will burn out more quickly. So having an awareness of what your vulnerabilities are, having an awareness of your burnout risk level, including I created an instrument that helps people measure their burnout risk. You can find that on my website. It's called the Burnout Risk Assessment, and it's very accurate. We're actually working on validating it for research purposes, but essentially it will tell you, if you are at moderate or high risk of burnout. It offers a number of suggestions to what do you do then with that awareness. Having an awareness of all of these things will only get you so far, and then you have to make some decisions about whether you need to personally make some changes, or you may need to work with your leader or your HR leader to find ways to make some changes in your work environment. The awareness chapter also covers a lot of what I call what makes you tick and what ticks you off.
Yeah.
So what makes you tick is all about understanding, having an awareness of what motivates you. So the more we understand and are really aware of what it is that motivates me and gets me engaged and inspired and wanting to perform at my best at work, is more likely to set me up for experiences where I won't burn out if I'm putting myself in those experiences. So that's what makes me tick. And the second part is what ticks me off. That's understanding your triggers. So to the degree that we can understand what it is that's triggering our stress, and more importantly, what the underlying reason is for that trigger, the better we're able to manage it. So Lars, for example, you and I might work in the exact same environment, report to the same boss, same stressors all day long, right? Well, there may be something in that environment that triggers my stress because of a past experience or because of my personality or maybe my temperament. And so I'm triggered more quickly or easily than you might be. And so that those type of situations would make me more prone to or more vulnerable to burnout. So that's awareness. I'll touch quickly on some of the regulation stuff. I have a number of strategies in there for helping people regulate their emotions, their thoughts, and their behaviors when they're under stress. Whether that's acute stress, something that spikes your stress really quickly from a 3 to a 7, or whether it's chronic stress for a long period of time. I offer a number of strategies based on what my research participants are telling me for how they can regulate emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. And then there's a lot of really great research, not my research, but other people's research that shows us how we can regulate our nervous system. Now, you and I have probably very different nervous systems. And again, certain things may trigger me that may not trigger you. But to the degree that we can understand and really have an awareness of how our nervous system works, we can then better regulate it. For example, I know that I get triggered if I see someone bullying someone else or someone talking down to someone else, like that sets me off. And so I know what that does to my nervous system. I have a heightened awareness now of if my blood pressure is going up or my heart rate, and I know what I need to do. And that may be different than what you need to do, but I know what I need to do to regulate it so I can bring my nervous system back to an equilibrium level and then be able to think more clearly about how I might want to respond.
Yeah. I'm curious, how do you do that? Like, what do you see as being some coping mechanisms that, yourself or others in your research have used to kind of lower those stress levels when they feel them spiking, when they find themselves being triggered by certain events, the ones that are, self-tuned to kind of understand those stressors and what they do to them. What are some ways that you found that people can effectively like self-regulate and lower that to a healthier level before it spikes to levels that are more prone to burnout?
Right. And that's it. So I'll give you a strategy that I use and it works for me all the time. But really what we're trying to do with this particular strategy is we're trying to slow our thinking down. Because when we're stressed, when something spikes our stress level from a 3 to a 7 really quickly, we have a lot of things going on physiologically that will basically set us off into fast thinking mode, is what Daniel Kahneman refers to as fast thinking. It locks us into being more judgmental, critical, feeling more anxious, and wanting to be more reactive rather than responsive. So we would need to, the goal here with this method I'm going to share with you is to slow our thinking down and basically like regulate our emotions so that we can get back into the thinking part of our brain. So I learned this particular strategy from Dr. Howard Stevenson at the University of Pennsylvania. Fortunately, I learned it before I had a really major situation where I had to use it. But it's called CLCBE, and that stands for calculate, locate, communicate, breathe, and exhale. So when you feel your stress level spiking, you feel your nervous system revving up really rapidly, first thing is calculate. On a scale of 1 to 10, where am I at? If I'm a 7 or above, I'm triggered. I am definitely, my amygdala is hijacking me and I'm potentially at risk of doing something, reacting in a really emotional way. So calculate. The second one is locate. Where in my body am I feeling it? So when you're triggered, like you say that number in your head, a 7, 8, or 9, or 10, and then I'm feeling it in my chest. I'm feeling like this heaviness in my chest or wherever you're feeling it. The next C is for communicate. noticing what is the self-talk you have going on in your brain. In my particular situation, I remember telling myself, I'm about to let loose on this guy that was attacking some other people. Like this mama bear instinct came out of me. And I noticed myself saying to myself, I want to yell back at him. But I also noticed my self-talk saying, and I want to be impeccable here. I don't want to do or say anything that I'm later going to regret when this situation happened. And then the last steps are to breathe, breathe. There's a method where you breathe into the count of 4, and then you exhale to the count of 7, or whatever works for you. For me, it's 4 and 7. For others, it might be different. But that method alone, I've used it over and over again. Fortunately, I've gotten better to the point where I can do it almost without thinking about it. But if if one of my kids does something that sets me off, or I get an email that's surprising and unexpected, anything that's going to set my stress level off, I know that method will bring my thinking brain back online as I'm getting my emotions under control and my nervous system under control.
Yeah. And I appreciate the kind of specific example of how to address that. When you think about stress triggers, and I realize that stress triggers are an individual phenomenon, right? Everybody's going to have their own stress triggers, and some will have similar ones, but for the most part, at an individual level, they're going to be unique to a single person. But I imagine in your research, you probably obviously interviewed a lot of different individuals with a lot of different research to determine what their stress triggers might be. Did you find any overlap, right? Where these 3 stress triggers were most common, right? And I asked this question more for, a lot of our audience are in either, executive leadership functions within organizations, and perhaps them having more awareness of environmental stress drivers that may be more likely to cause burnout in their employee populations. They may have more of awareness around how they might diffuse some of those things.
Yeah, I think the one that's coming to mind is when I interviewed the chief medical officers, that first study. So these are physicians who have been trained to be clinical experts, right? Treating patients. And then they're put in, or they choose to be, or they're promoted into roles where they have a lot of leadership responsibility. So executive level, very high level executive level expectations, and the pressures and the challenges that come along with that job. Many of them told me that in their clinical days, when they were primarily treating patients, if they were an emergency room physician or a trauma surgeon, they could handle that kind of stress. It was unexpected. They were trained for it. But they were more, when they moved into their leadership and administrative roles, they were more likely to be triggered by conflict with other coworkers, more triggered by politics and things that just required them to negotiate with other people in the work environment. They were more triggered by having to protect their budget than they were with having to treat a patient with a gunshot wound who was about to die on them. So it's interesting. And I heard the same thing with the police chiefs too. I had one guy tell me that he subjectively felt significantly more stress when he was having to deal with staffing issues than the stress that he felt when he was being chased by a bad guy with a gun who was shooting at other people. That's pretty interesting to think about. People who are trained for certain types of environments and contexts, they learn how to deal with that type of stress. But then you put them in a very different environment where they haven't been trained, they haven't developed the skills for the job, and they also haven't learned how to cope or develop the coping skills for that particular kind of stress. They're going to feel subjectively much more stressed than someone who's been trained for it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm curious as well, did your research find any difference from a generational perspective on how people in your studies kind of coped with stress? Was there any kind of maybe unexpected variances in how different generations might cope with stress and burnout?
So not so much in my research. I would say there's a lot of homogeneity in terms of generational differences in my research participants. But I'll tell you what I have been hearing a lot of, and I conduct a lot of workshops, like thousands of people a year will go through these workshops. And inevitably, I would say 80% of the time, someone in the workshop wants to bring up the whole generational differences and the fact that the younger generations don't deal with stress like they did. Many of them are in their 40s, 50s, 60s year old, they're in their mid-career or late career stage. And they were raised in their profession to wear stress like a badge of honor. And we just suck it up, and that's what we do. And we don't complain about it. And, that's just the way things are around here. And so their stories that they share with me around millennials and Gen Zs are significantly different. They talk about how, these kids these days, they will advocate for themselves like we didn't. They will complain about things. Their experience of the same stress that I had 20 or 30 years ago just seems like it's much more intense than what I dealt with. And I think that's primarily two things. One is primarily because the younger generations are experiencing more stress. They have, they just went through a pandemic. They worked through a pandemic. We did too, but that was perhaps some of their first work experiences if they were new to the work environment. And many of them are experiencing levels of anxiety that we haven't seen before. And so when there are high degrees of stress and anxiety in one's personal life, primarily with younger generations, that's going to carry over into the work context. They're likely not going to have the same level of capacity to deal with work stress like someone who doesn't have the same anxiety level or stress level outside of work. So I'm hearing about it more anecdotally than anything else, but there probably is research out there that has looked at generational differences.
Yeah. I also wonder as you kind of describe that, how much of this is also due to the shifting attitudes and perceptions towards mental health.
Yeah.
And openness about that, right? I think younger, or I should say older generations perhaps were less likely, there wasn't a mental health day in the vernacular of, employee support, even a decade ago, let alone 2 decades ago. And I think that the conversations and the attitudes have largely shifted around that, but perhaps there are some, in older generations that have not shifted at the same speed that some of these conversations have around how we think about mental health and mental well-being and the role that stress plays in that.
I absolutely agree with that. And it's good. That's good news, actually, I think, in that we're normalizing the conversations we're having around mental health and beginning to see a reduction in the stigma in healthcare, for example. I work at a lot of healthcare organizations where it was taboo. You don't talk about your mental health years ago. And now it's much more common. People are, in fact, I work with a number of physicians who are conducting their own studies with their residents and with their fellows. And they're encouraging open conversation around mental health much more than what they experienced when they were residents and fellows. But the other thing I'm hearing and seeing a lot is that, and I actually can relate to this because I have 3 young boys. They're 17, 19, and 21 years old. And that I think we're seeing a trend too with a lot of Gen Zs and millennials who were raised by parents who taught them how to advocate for themselves. So with my boys, like I taught them when they were in middle school and high school that if they got a grade that they didn't agree with their teacher, that they should speak up. I shouldn't have to get involved. I taught them to speak up for themselves. And I think that's more common today than it used to be. And so as those kids are going into the workforce, they're more likely to speak up to their boss when their mental health is affected, more so than what we experienced, I think, when we entered the workforce.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I would love to, last question I have for you, just to kind of close this out. Somebody is watching, right? And I imagine many people will fit this definition right now, but they themselves are in a state of burnout. They've been, for whatever reason, whatever the triggers might be, whatever the duration that they've been carrying it, but they're certainly in a burnout state right now. What advice do you have for people who are burned out? They're there, they're kind of in that stage now. What should they do once they have kind of reached the stage of burnout to, help kind of step back from the stress levels that they're experiencing and take care of themselves so they can operate more wholly at work or in their personal lives?
Yeah. I've interviewed a number of people, and I've interviewed a number of people who were in active burnout when I interviewed them, as well as people who had experienced burnout before, but then had recovered and they were, back in the work environment. And then with my own personal experience. So there are some absolute recommendations for people. The whole last chapter of the book is what I call the 3RX prescription. 3 R's. The first R is recover. Second R is reconnect. The third R is reimagine. So in the recover section, I talk a lot about micro recovery. So if you are in a high stress job that is causing you to feel burned out, or you're at risk, maybe you're not burned out now, but you're at risk of potentially burning out pretty quickly. There are a number of recommendations in there for how to implement or build in more micro recovery practices. And that might involve just some daily things, some simple things like getting up, you setting an alarm and getting up from your desk at least every 90 minutes. Or recovery for you might look like needing to take an extended amount of time off so that you can not just rest your body and your mind and your psyche, but also so you can regain perspective and move to the next phase, which is all about reconnection. So, but back to recovery, one of the things that I'll never forget, I had an emergency medicine physician tell me that during COVID, she was working at a very large health system. We saw on TV what these physicians and nurses were going through, and she knew she was burned out, but she had to keep working. There were just not enough physicians and staff to give her a day off. So she was literally working around the clock for a couple of weeks on end. And when she was able to take some time off and actually rest a little bit, something just hit her. And she said, I just realized that I can't heal in the same place that's making me sick. And she went on to describe how that environment and what she was experiencing was making her psychologically sick, which is what burnout is. It's a psychological syndrome. And so she realized that she had to stay, and she was committed to following through on her shifts, but she knew that she wasn't going to really be able to start to recover and heal until she got out of that environment. So I followed up with her, and I think hers is a story that is similar to others, where what she did after she went through a period of recovery, and it wasn't an overnight recovery, it was an extended period of time where she got herself in a different work environment with more resources and better resources. But she then was able to spend some time reconnecting to the people, places, and experiences that brought her joy outside of work. And so that part of that last chapter of my book really focuses on helping readers reflect on what are the values that you hold dear to you. What are the things in life and the people in your life, the experiences in your life that matter most to you? And how can you reconnect to those things and regain your perspective on how you're what you're experiencing at work, as well as how you're dealing with that work stress. So there's a whole set of recommendations, more specific around how to reconnect to values, people, places, and experiences.
Yeah.
And then the final part is all about reimagining. So when people do recover from burnout, oftentimes they don't want to retire. They actually want to go back into the workforce, and they want to find a way that they can contribute and add value, but they need to reimagine and spend some time really reflecting on and reimagining, how do you want work to fit into your life, not the other way around. So reimagining the relationship that you want to have with work after recovering from burnout.
Well, Kandi, I really appreciate the tips. Hopefully those will be valuable to those of you in the audience who are watching or listening who may be experiencing this yourself. And again, there's so many great takeaways in the book. So I strongly recommend you get yourself a copy and you can learn more firsthand. And this may be a book that you'll also be gifting to colleagues, as well as, just the challenge of burnout is something that is so commonplace these days. Kandi, where is the best place for people to get a copy of the book?
Yep. It's online pretty much anywhere you look. But if you go to my website, kandiwiens.com, and it's KandiWiens.com, you'll see links to all the online, or most of the online resellers. And anyone who's interested in buying 5 or more copies, you can reach out to me directly through my website, and I can offer 25% discount. And then we have some other incentives too. If folks want to do like 100 books, I'll do a free private webinar for you and your colleagues at work.
That's great. Well, and also, do you take advantage of the burnout assessment tool that Kandi mentioned on our website as well? So, Kandi, thank you so much for bringing this important topic to light, and thank you for helping myself and our audience learn a little bit more about ways that we can protect ourselves.
Oh, thank you, Lars. I really appreciate the opportunity to get the message out and ask people to help me figure out a way to bring the burnout levels down. I know that's what we all care about. So it's going to take a collective effort. So thank you for the opportunity.
It will. Well, thank you for your leadership here.
Mm-hmm.